The November issue of Down East Magazine is out and, as usual, provides a broad variety of articles that will give you new ways to think about and to look at the state of Maine. And with us here on 207, Editor-in-Chief Brian Kevin. Thank you for coming in.
Thanks for having me.
Pleasure to have you.
Yeah.
Let's start with a Maine moment. One of the photographs at the beginning of the magazine. This is a shot that I really loved of a church in Parsonsfield.
Yeah, this is an image by a photographer named Charles Cormier. We solicit these every month, and if you're watching and you want to send in, we are always looking for good Maine moments, but we're always looking for something that has like a little bit of storytelling to it. Something about this seemed to resonate maybe a little bit with the Halloween holiday. It's like a smidge spooky, but it just has an awful lot of atmosphere, and you can feel the history.
Yeah, atmospheric indeed. A profile of a gentleman who makes birch bark moose calls, and this is a fascinating little piece.
Yeah, I think Jed Coffin, the writer, really enjoyed talking to Butch Phillips, who lives up in Milford. He was raised on Indian Island. He's a Penobscot elder in his 80s, and he is one of the last people still practicing this art, making these birch bark moose calls by hand. They're pretty simple in terms of how they operate. I mean, they're basically a tiny funnel or a megaphone, he explains, but what he does that makes them really special is sort of carving art, some of the patterns of which, go back, that have been shared with him from older folks in the Penobscot Nation. And they're really, call a moose or don't call a moose, they're beautiful to look at.
Yeah, just on pure aesthetics, regardless of what kind of sound they make, they are elegant.
And Butch Phillips, he's pretty funny in the article. He sort of talks about this as being something he'd always done, and it wasn't until fairly recently that he realized how passionately people respond to these and how fond of them that they are.
You've got a nice feature called Tales from the Borderlands, which looks at life on both sides of the Maine border with New Brunswick and Canada. What were you trying to do with this piece?
We've been wanting to do something about the Canadian border. We had a plan for 2020, and suddenly you couldn't go to Canada, particularly conveniently, for a year and a half, 2 years. And so we're looking at all the different ways in which, if you happen to live on the border or work along the Maine's border with Canada, that border can be, let's say, a little ephemeral. I mean, it's a bit of an abstraction, and there are people who, not only work on both sides of it or live on both sides of it or have family on both sides of it, but who recreate on both sides of it and who maybe don't think of it as that like rigid of a division.
Two of the specific elements in that article, one looks at what you call two-nation vacation.
Yeah. So there's a service element to it, stuff you can do, and one of the things that I think people overlook is we tend to think of calloused Mainers as like the end of the road. It's way out there, but you cross the border and there's like, among other things, a bustling resort community of St. Andrews on the other side, where there's some of the best restaurants in Canada, some like really luxurious hotels and things. There's beautiful park properties along what we tongue-in-cheekily call the St. Croix Riviera, including the St. Croix National Historic Site, which is, I think, the least visited national park property in Maine, and very cool.
It's my new favorite term, the St. Croix Riviera.
It's a great
and you've
spot.
got another quick piece that you wrote on called Walking the Line, and this is on the highest point along the border.
I will cop to the fact that I wrote this piece, but I did it on the strength of information from the photographer. I have not been out to Monument Peak yet, which is, it's about 20 miles northwest of Eustis. It's the highest point on the Canadian border on this side of Montana, and it's a great little hike. It doesn't see a ton of traffic. The easiest way to get to it is from the Canadian side, but once you access the trailhead, you're literally walking the border, this 20-foot swath that is cleared all across this country by a team of woods workers who have to maintain this at all times. It's a crazy undertaking to think about.
Now let's end with the cover story, which takes a look at the impact of rising seas caused by climate change and how communities all along the Maine coast are or are not dealing with this issue.
A really fascinating package. All the credit for this goes to the folks at the Maine Monitor, Maine's nonprofit reporting initiative, and the Pulitzer Center that we partnered with on this project. A photographer named Alex McLean took some outstanding aerial photos of places around the Maine coast that are being or will soon be impacted by even slight amounts of rising seas that are predicted over the course of the next 50 years, and the ways that that's going to play out in some of these Maine communities, how they're trying to head it off now, or at least plan for it. Kate Koff, the Maine Monitor reporter, did an awesome job of reporting these stories out. You can get a bit of a preview in the issue and see these photos looking pretty. To read the whole stories, you go to themainemonitor.org. There's also an event coming up with Kate, with Alex the photographer, with a couple smart people and marine scientists and things talking about this phenomenon on November 16th at the Gulf of Maine Research Institute, and all that information is also on themainmonitor.org.
And the aerial photographs give you a different perspective and I think a new sense perhaps of the vulnerability of so much of the coast.
It's towns that are going to have to relocate gravestones in their cemeteries because they're too close to the water. It's places where critical infrastructure is going to be impacted. Places like Damariscotta, where I used to live, where the hospital that I have my kids is separated from the mainland, such as it is, by a causeway that's slowly, chipping away. It's all these sort of little things that are navigable, but only if we start thinking about them now.
Lots of great stuff to think about in that issue.
It's a great story.
Brian, Kevin, thank you as always.
Thanks.
Again, it's the November issue of Down East, which is on sale now. We will be back with more of 207 in just a moment.